"You'll never have the courage to leave me, Carrie," Mason Shaw said, with that cold, dismissive laugh I'd grown to hate. "You're too weak, too dependent. You need me." He grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door, completely confident in his assessment of my character. What Mason didn't know was that I'd already signed the divorce papers that morning and spent the last 6 months systematically planning my escape from 18 years of emotional warfare. The front door slammed behind him with that familiar force that made the windows rattle. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The same aggressive punctuation mark he'd been using to end our conversations for years. I stood in our pristine kitchen, surrounded by the silence he always left in his wake, and felt something I hadn't experienced in nearly 2 decades. Complete clarity about who I really was underneath all his carefully constructed lies about my inadequacies. This is the story of how I went from being a woman who apologized for existing to the architect of my own liberation. It's about recognizing emotional abuse for what it is, finding strength you never knew you had, and discovering that sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply refusing to be small anymore. It's about the day I stopped being Mason Shaw's victim and started being Carrie York again. But let me start at the beginning, because understanding how I got to that moment, standing in my kitchen with divorce papers in my purse and a moving truck scheduled for that afternoon, requires understanding the systematic way someone can convince you that your reality isn't real, that your feelings don't matter, and that you should be grateful for treatment that slowly kills your spirit. Mason Shaw was a master of emotional manipulation, though I didn't have the vocabulary to describe it that way for most of our marriage. What I knew was that conversations with my husband left me feeling confused, small, and somehow always in the wrong. What I knew was that I'd stopped expressing opinions because they were inevitably met with ridicule. What I knew was that I'd learned to anticipate his moods and adjust my behavior accordingly, walking on eggshells in my own home. The morning that changed everything started like any other morning in the Shaw household. Mason came downstairs already dressed for work, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his dark hair styled with the kind of precision that reflected his need to control every detail of his environment, including me. "Coffee's ready," I said quietly, the same words I'd spoken every morning for 18 years. He poured himself a cup without acknowledgement, scanning his phone with the intense focus he reserved for anything that wasn't me. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the words I'd learned not to say, all the needs I'd learned not to express. "I'm thinking about taking that photography class at the community center," I ventured, immediately regretting the words as they left my mouth. I'd seen the course listing weeks ago, felt a flicker of the old excitement I used to feel about creating something beautiful, but I'd kept the idea to myself until this moment of temporary courage. Mason looked up from his phone with that expression I knew so well, the slight raise of his eyebrows that communicated both surprise and disappointment that I'd dared to speak without being spoken to. "Photography?" He said the word like it tasted bad. "Carrie, you can barely manage the household responsibilities you already have. Do you really think you need another hobby to neglect?" The casual cruelty was so familiar I almost accepted it automatically. Almost, but something was different that morning. Maybe it was the way the sunlight was streaming through our kitchen window, illuminating the life I'd built around his preferences. Maybe it was the realization that I'd stopped having dreams because he'd taught me they were foolish. Maybe it was just that after 18 years of diminishment, I'd finally reached my limit. "I think I'd enjoy it," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Enjoy it?" Mason laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Carrie, you're 42 years old. Don't you think it's time to accept reality? You're not artistic, you're not creative, you're barely competent at the basic functions of running a household. Photography classes are for people with actual talent, not bored housewives looking for validation." Each word landed like a physical blow, but this time, instead of absorbing the pain and apologizing for my presumption, I found myself really listening to what he was saying, really hearing the systematic way he dismantled my confidence, the calculated precision with which he attacked any spark of independence or self-worth. "Maybe you're right," I said, but something in my tone must have been different, because Mason's eyes sharpened with suspicion. "Of course I'm right," he replied, studying my face. I'm always right about these things, Carrie. That's why our marriage works, because I understand reality and you understand your limitations. Our marriage works. The phrase echoed in my mind as I watched him finish his coffee and gather his things for work. Our marriage worked for him because he'd created a dynamic where I existed solely to support his needs, validate his superiority, and absorb his emotional violence without complaint. But what if I stopped accepting his version of reality? What if his assessment of my limitations was actually a reflection of his need to keep me small? What if the woman he'd convinced was incompetent and worthless was actually someone who'd been systematically prevented from discovering her own strength? I have late meetings tonight, Mason announced, checking his reflection in the hallway mirror. Don't wait up. Late meetings. The same excuse he'd been using for months, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who knew his wife would never question his whereabouts, never demand accountability, never challenge his authority. Of course, I replied automatically. He paused at the door, turning back with that expression that always preceded his most devastating attacks on my self-worth. And Carrie, let's drop this photography nonsense. You embarrass yourself when you pretend to be more than you are. I'm trying to protect you from that kind of humiliation. The door slammed behind him, and I stood in the sudden silence of our kitchen, feeling something crack open inside my chest. Not breaking, opening. Like I'd been holding my breath for 18 years and suddenly remembered how to breathe. He was trying to protect me from humiliation? Or was he trying to protect himself from the threat of a wife who might discover her own worth, her own voice, her own power? For the first time in years, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that Mason Shaw might be wrong about me. Completely, fundamentally wrong. And if he was wrong about my limitations, what else might he be wrong about? That thought, dangerous, rebellious, liberating, planted itself in my mind like a seed that had been waiting 18 years for the right conditions to grow. I was about to find out exactly how much Mason Shaw had underestimated the woman he'd spent nearly 2 decades trying to destroy. I met Mason Shaw when I was 24 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in graphic design and dreams that felt as big as the sky. I was Carrie York then, confident, creative, full of ideas and energy. I had plans to start my own design studio, to travel, to create art that would make people feel something beautiful and true. Mason was 28, already climbing the corporate ladder at Clyde Financial Services as an investment advisor. He was charming in that polished, professional way that made me feel sophisticated just by being in his presence. He wore expensive suits, drove a luxury car, and had this way of making me feel like I was the most fascinating woman in any room. Our early courtship was a whirlwind of expensive dinners, weekend getaways, and conversations where he seemed genuinely interested in my artistic ambitions. He'd ask about my design projects, encourage my creativity, and tell me how refreshing it was to meet someone with real talent and vision. "You're going to do amazing things, Carrie," he'd say, stroking my hair as we lay in bed talking about our futures. "I can see it in you, this incredible creative energy. I want to support that. I want to be part of your success." The shift happened so gradually I barely noticed it happening. It started with helpful suggestions about my career choices. Maybe freelance design work was too unstable for someone planning a serious future. Maybe I should consider a more practical application of my skills, something in marketing or corporate communications that would provide steady income and benefits. "I just worry about you struggling as an artist," Mason would say, his voice full of concern. "The creative field is so competitive, so unpredictable. I've seen too many talented people get crushed by the business side of it. I don't want that to happen to you." His concern felt like love, his practical advice seemed wise and protective. When he suggested I take a position at a mid-sized marketing firm instead of pursuing freelance work, I convinced myself it was a smart compromise. I could build my portfolio while earning steady income, then transition to independent work once I was more established. But the marketing job turned out to be soul-crushing work creating generic advertisements for products I didn't care about. My creativity withered under the demands of corporate mediocrity, and my portfolio remained static, while I churned out forgettable campaigns for quarterly quotas. Mason's response to my growing dissatisfaction was always the same, understanding mixed with gentle reality checks. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I know it's not your dream job, he'd say, but it's building valuable experience. And honestly, Carrie, the commercial art world is brutal. This job is giving you stability and professional development that most artists never get. When I mentioned feeling creatively unfulfilled, he'd remind me of friends who'd struggled financially pursuing artistic careers. When I talked about missing the excitement of creative challenges, he'd point out how lucky I was to have predictable income and good benefits. Gradually, I stopped talking about my artistic ambitions altogether. It was easier than defending dreams that Mason consistently framed as impractical fantasies. Our wedding was beautiful, everything planned according to Mason's vision of what an elegant celebration should look like. I'd originally wanted something smaller and more personal, maybe an outdoor ceremony that reflected my love of natural beauty. But Mason convinced me that his family and professional contacts expected a certain level of sophistication. We're establishing ourselves as serious people, he explained. The wedding sets the tone for how people will view our marriage, our social standing, our future prospects. Don't you want people to take us seriously? Of course I did. So we had the church ceremony, the country club reception, the photographer who captured every moment according to traditional poses that looked perfect but felt empty. I smiled in pictures wearing a dress I'd never chosen, celebrating a vision of marriage that somehow didn't include any of my actual preferences. The early years of our marriage followed the same pattern of gentle erosion disguised as practical wisdom. Mason handled all our finances because he understood investments and long-term planning better than I did. He chose our social circle because his professional network offered better opportunities for advancement. He selected our home because he could evaluate the neighborhood's potential for property value appreciation. Each decision was presented as logical, beneficial, and made with my best interests in mind. But somehow, my interests never seemed to align with my actual desires, my preferences, or my instincts about what would make me happy. "You're so trusting, Carrie," Mason would say when I questioned his choices. "It's one of the things I love about you, but it also means you don't always see the bigger picture. That's what I'm here for, to make sure we're making smart decisions for our future." I learned to doubt my own judgment. When I felt uncomfortable with his controlling behavior, he'd explain why my feelings were overreactions. When I missed my old independence, he'd remind me of all the security and stability our partnership provided. When I expressed frustration with decisions made without my input, he'd patiently walk me through his reasoning until I felt foolish for questioning his superior analytical skills. The photography class incident wasn't the first time Mason had dismissed my interests, but it was the first time I'd really heard the cruelty beneath his practical concerns. Maybe it was because I'd finally reached my limit of feeling small and insignificant in my own life. Maybe it was because 18 years of systematic diminishment had worn away every layer of self-doubt, leaving only the core truth of who I actually was. Or maybe it was because I'd started to notice things I'd been trained not to see. The way Mason's eyes lit up when he talked about his work but grew cold when I mentioned anything important to me. The way he encouraged me to be ambitious and independent when we were dating, but systematically discouraged those same qualities after we married. The way he claimed to love my unique perspective while consistently overruling every opinion I expressed. I'd become a supporting character in my own life, applauding Mason's achievements while my own dreams collected dust in the corners of our perfectly appointed home. I'd learned to anticipate his needs, manage his moods, and minimize my own presence to avoid triggering his criticism. But that morning, standing in our kitchen after he'd dismissed my interest in photography as delusion and incompetence, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anger. Pure, clean, clarifying anger at being treated like a burden rather than a partner, like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be loved. And with that anger came a dangerous question: what would happen if I stopped accepting Mason's version of who I was supposed to be? The afternoon of the photography class conversation, I found myself standing in our guest bedroom that had become my unofficial retreat, the one room in our house where Mason rarely ventured because it held no interest for him. Among the boxes of my old belongings that I'd packed away over the years, I discovered something that stopped me cold: my college portfolio. I hadn't looked at these pieces in over a decade. Mason had suggested we store them when we moved into our current house 5 years ago, claiming we needed the space for more practical items. But as I opened the leather portfolio case, I was confronted with work I'd completely forgotten: designs that were bold, innovative, and undeniably talented. There was the logo I'd created for a local nonprofit that had won a regional design competition. The magazine layout that my professors had used as an example for subsequent classes. The branding package for a small restaurant that had told me my work helped double their business in the first year. I sat on the floor surrounded by evidence of abilities that Mason had convinced me I didn't possess. These weren't the fumbling attempts of someone with no artistic talent. These were the professional quality creations of someone with genuine skill, creativity, and vision. How had I forgotten this? How had I allowed someone else's assessment of my capabilities to override the tangible proof of my own achievements? I pulled out my old sketchbooks, flipping through pages of ideas and concepts that sparkled with the kind of creative energy Mason claimed I lacked. Drawing after drawing showed a mind that thought in visual solutions, that could take complex problems and translate them into elegant, effective designs. The woman who had created this work was confident, decisive, and skilled. She was someone who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to put her ideas into the world. What had happened to her? I knew exactly what had happened. Mason had happened. For 18 years, he'd been systematically rewriting my personal history, convincing me that my successes had been flukes, that my confidence had been naive arrogance, that my ambitions had been unrealistic fantasies. He'd taken a woman who knew her own value and convinced her she was worthless. But the evidence was right here in my hands. I hadn't imagined my talent. I hadn't overestimated my abilities. I had been genuinely good at what I did, and Mason had spent our entire marriage convincing me otherwise. The realization hit me like a physical blow. If he'd been wrong about my artistic abilities, what else had he been wrong about? How many other aspects of my personality, my intelligence, my worth had he systematically distorted? I thought about all the times he'd dismissed my opinions as emotional or illogical. All the times he'd made financial decisions without consulting me because I didn't understand complex matters. All the times he'd overruled my preferences because I had poor judgment about important choices. What if my judgment wasn't poor? What if my emotions weren't excessive? What if my opinions weren't worthless? I started making a mental list of recent incidents where Mason had dismissed my concerns or insights. Last month, I'd suggested we should reconsider our investment strategy because something felt unstable about the market. Mason had laughed and told me I was being anxious about things I didn't understand. 2 weeks later, news broke about exactly the kind of economic shifts I'd been sensing. 3 months ago, I'd expressed concerns about his business partner David Clyde, something about the man's behavior that struck me as dishonest. Mason had accused me of being judgmental and paranoid, unable to appreciate sophisticated business relationships. But I'd noticed David's discomfort when I asked simple questions about their projects, the way his explanations never quite made sense. 6 months ago, I'd suggested we should be more involved in our community, that Mason's increasing isolation from neighbors and old friends seemed unhealthy. He'd explained that successful people naturally outgrow their earlier social circles, that I was being sentimental about relationships that no longer served our interests. In each case, Mason had positioned himself as the rational, knowledgeable authority, and me as the emotional, confused observer. But looking back with clear eyes, I realized my instincts had been accurate every time. My concerns had been valid. My judgment had been sound. He hadn't been protecting me from my own poor decision-making. He'd been protecting himself from my accurate assessments of situations he preferred I not understand. I pulled out my phone and did something I hadn't done in years. I called my college roommate Sarah, who'd been my closest friend before Mason convinced me that maintaining old friendships was a sign of emotional immaturity.
Carrie,
Sarah's voice was warm but surprised. Oh my God, I was just thinking about you last week. How are you? The simple question made me realize I didn't know how to answer it. How was I? When was the last time someone had asked me that question and actually waited for a real response? Mime, I'm not sure, I said honestly. Sarah, can I ask you something? Do you remember my design work from college? Are you kidding? You were the most talented person in our program. Professor Martinez used your portfolio as the example for good design thinking for years after we graduated. Why? The validation hit me like sunlight after years in a cave. I found my old portfolio today, and I'd forgotten how good it was. I've been told for so long that I don't have real artistic talent that I started believing it. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Carrie, Sarah said finally, her voice careful, who told you that you don't have artistic talent? Because that's insane. You had job offers from 3 major firms before graduation. You won the Creativity Award 2 years running. You were the person everyone else looked up to. The person everyone else looked up to. I tried to reconcile that description with the woman Mason had convinced me I was incompetent, impractical, lacking in real-world skills or meaningful abilities. My husband, I said quietly. Mason has always said I'm not really artistic, that I don't understand the commercial side of design, that my work isn't professional quality. Another long silence. Carrie, Sarah said, and her voice had changed, become gentle but firm. I need you to listen to me very carefully. Everything you just said is a lie. Not a mistake, not a difference of opinion. A lie. You are one of the most naturally gifted designers I've ever known. And if someone who claims to love you has convinced you otherwise, then that person is either blind or deliberately hurting you. Deliberately hurting me. The words settled into my consciousness like pieces of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve for 18 years. What if Mason's dismissal of my abilities wasn't protective concern? What if it was deliberate sabotage? After hanging up with Sarah, I sat in that guest bedroom surrounded by evidence of my own competence, feeling like I was seeing my life clearly for the first time in 18 years. But the human mind has an incredible capacity for self-protection, and mine immediately began working overtime to rationalize what I'd discovered. Maybe Mason wasn't deliberately undermining me. Maybe he genuinely believed his assessments of my limitations. Maybe his constant criticism came from a place of concern rather than control. Maybe I was overreacting to what was simply his honest opinion about my abilities. I tried to convince myself that couples often saw each other's weaknesses more clearly than their strengths. Perhaps Mason was just being realistic about my artistic skills while I was being overly sentimental about old college work. After all, there was a big difference between student projects and professional success in the real world. But even as I tried to rationalize his behavior, specific memories kept surfacing that challenged my explanations. I remembered the time, early in our marriage, when I'd been commissioned to design a logo for a friend's new business. I'd been excited about the project, working on concepts in the evenings and weekends. When I showed Mason my preliminary sketches, his response had been lukewarm at best. It's nice, Carrie, but is it really professional enough? I'd hate for you to embarrass yourself with amateur work. His doubt had infected my confidence. I'd second-guessed every design choice, revised the concept multiple times, and ultimately delivered work that felt watered down and safe. The client had accepted it but without the enthusiasm I'd hoped for. Mason's response had been a knowing nod. I tried to warn you, he'd said gently. Design work is harder than it looks from the outside. But what if the problem hadn't been my design skills? What if the problem had been the way Mason's criticism had sabotaged my creative confidence? What if my original concepts had been strong, and his doubt had made me second-guess my instincts until I produced inferior work? I thought about another incident from a few years ago. I'd mentioned wanting to update our home's interior design, suggesting some changes that would make the space feel warmer and more personal. Mason had listened politely, then explained why each of my ideas would be impractical or aesthetically questionable. You have good instincts, sweetheart, but interior design is really about understanding spatial relationships and color theory. It's more technical than people realize. I dropped the subject, accepting his assessment that I lacked the sophisticated understanding necessary for such decisions. But now I wondered, had my ideas actually been good? Had Mason dismissed them not because they were flawed, but because implementing them would have meant acknowledging my aesthetic judgment? The more I examined our history, the more I saw a pattern of Mason positioning himself as the expert on my own capabilities. He'd convinced me that my instincts were unreliable, my skills were amateur, and my judgment was poor. But he'd done it so gradually, so gently, that I'd never recognized it as systematic undermining. I tried calling my sister Abby, hoping for another perspective on my situation. We'd grown distant over the years, another relationship that Mason had encouraged me to deprioritize because Abby was too emotional and not a good influence on my personal growth. Carrie, what a surprise. Abby's voice was genuinely happy to hear from me. I was just telling Mom how much I miss talking to you. How are things? They're complicated, I said, then found myself telling her about the photography class conversation and my discovery of my old portfolio. Abby listened without interrupting, but I could hear her growing concern in the small sounds she made, little intakes of breath, quiet ims that suggested she was processing disturbing information. Carrie, she said, when I finished, I need to tell you something, and I hope you won't get angry with me for bringing it up. My stomach tightened with anticipation. Do you remember your birthday party 3 years ago? The one where you'd spent weeks planning this beautiful outdoor celebration? I remembered. I'd been so excited about the theme I'd developed, the decorations I'd designed, the whole vision I'd created for an elegant garden party. But when Mason saw the setup, he'd pointed out numerous problems with my planning. The lighting was inadequate for evening guests. The seating arrangement didn't facilitate proper conversation flow. The food presentation looked amateurish compared to professional catering standards. Mason said the party wasn't sophisticated enough for his colleagues. I told Abby. He was right. I hadn't thought through all the logistics properly. Carrie, that party was gorgeous. Everyone talked about it for months. Mom still brings up how creative and elegant it was. But I watched Mason spend the entire evening pointing out problems that nobody else could see, making you feel like you'd failed when you'd actually created something beautiful. The memory shifted in my mind, Mason's criticism now seeming less like helpful feedback and more like deliberate sabotage of my confidence. I remember thinking at the time that he seemed almost angry that the party was successful, Abby continued carefully. Like he was looking for ways to undermine something you'd done well, angry that it was successful. The phrase resonated with something I'd sensed but never articulated. Mason did seem uncomfortable when I succeeded at things, when I demonstrated competence or creativity. His response to my achievements was always to minimize them, to find flaws, to redirect attention to aspects where I'd fallen short of some impossible standard. Abby, I said slowly, do you think Mason deliberately tries to make me feel incompetent? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. I think, Abby said carefully, that healthy partners celebrate each other's strengths and help each other grow. They don't spend years convincing each other that their natural abilities are inadequate. After we hung up, I sat in that guest bedroom, feeling like I was emerging from an 18-year fog. The evidence was overwhelming. Mason had been systematically undermining my confidence, dismissing my abilities, and convincing me to doubt my own judgment and worth. But accepting that truth meant accepting that my marriage was built on lies. It meant acknowledging that the man I'd loved and trusted had been deliberately damaging my sense of self for nearly 2 decades. The woman I'd been that morning, apologetic, uncertain, grateful for Mason's guidance, was starting to feel like a stranger. Someone I'd been convinced to become rather than someone I actually was. And if that was true, then who was I really underneath all his careful conditioning? That evening, I watched Mason across our dinner table with completely different eyes. For 18 years, I'd seen him as my anchor, my guide through complex decisions, my protection from my own poor judgment. Now I saw him as a puzzle I needed to solve. He was telling me about his day, the same monologue he delivered every evening about important meetings, difficult clients, and complex financial strategies that were beyond my understanding. But tonight, instead of nodding along and feeling grateful that he handled such sophisticated matters, I found myself analyzing his words, his tone, his body language. "The Morrison account is giving us some trouble," he said, cutting his steak with precise movements. "They're questioning our investment strategy, asking for detailed explanations that frankly demonstrate their lack of understanding about market complexities." I'd heard variations of this story countless times, clients who questioned Mason's expertise because they were too unsophisticated to appreciate his advanced knowledge. But tonight, I wondered what if the Morrisons' questions were legitimate? What if their concerns were valid, and Mason was dismissing them the same way he dismissed mine? "What kind of questions are they asking?" I said, surprising both of us with my follow-up inquiry. Mason paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, and gave me a sharp look. "Technical questions about portfolio allocation and risk assessment. Nothing you'd find interesting." There it was, the automatic dismissal, the assumption that my curiosity was inappropriate or pointless. But instead of accepting the shutdown, I pressed gently forward. "Try me," I said, with a small smile. "I might understand more than you think." Something flickered across Mason's face, annoyance, maybe, or surprise that I wasn't backing down immediately. "Carrie, trust me, you don't want to hear about yield curves and derivative exposure ratios. It's incredibly boring, unless you have the background to understand the implications." The condescension was so smooth, so practiced, that I realized he'd been using this exact formula for years. Claim the subject was too complex for me, then add that it would bore me anyway, then conclude with an assessment of my inadequate background knowledge. "Maybe I'd like to learn about those things," I said, keeping my voice light and curious rather than challenging. Mason set down his fork and studied me with the kind of intense focus he usually reserved for his work. "Where is this coming from? You've never shown interest in financial matters before." Maybe I've never felt like my interest was welcome before. The words came out before I'd consciously decided to say them, and they hung in the air between us like an accusation. Mason's expression shifted through several emotions: confusion, irritation, and something that looked almost like fear. "Of course your interest is welcome," he said, but his tone suggested the opposite. "I just don't want you to feel overwhelmed by information that takes years of study to properly understand." Years of study, as if basic curiosity about our family's financial situation required advanced degrees and professional certification, as if asking about his work was presumptuous rather than normal spousal conversation. "Well, maybe you could start with something simple," I suggested, "like how we're doing overall. Are we meeting our long-term financial goals?" Mason's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We're doing fine, Carrie. You don't need to worry about these things. That's my job. But I'd like to understand, Carrie." His voice carried a warning edge. I knew well. "You're being unusual tonight. Is something bothering you?" The question was designed to make me retreat, to apologize for overstepping boundaries I'd apparently violated by showing curiosity about my own life. But instead of backing down, I found myself really looking at his face, studying the way his features had hardened with displeasure at my unexpected persistence. "I'm just interested in our life together," I said carefully. "Is that unusual?" "It's unusual for you to question things that are working perfectly well," Mason replied. "I handle the finances because I'm qualified to handle them. You focus on the household because that's where your strengths lie. Why would we want to change a system that's been successful for 18 years? Successful for whom?" The question formed in my mind but didn't reach my lips, because I was beginning to understand that success, in Mason's definition, meant his complete control over every significant aspect of our shared life. "You're right," I said, offering him the submissive agreement he expected. I don't know why I was being so curious. Relief flooded Mason's features, and his familiar condescending smile returned. "It's okay, sweetheart. Sometimes we all get ideas that don't really make sense. That's why it's important to have someone who understands the bigger picture. Someone who understands the bigger picture, not someone who can help you understand, or someone to discuss things with, but someone who understands while I, presumably, could not." After dinner, Mason retreated to his home office to finish some important work, leaving me to clean up the kitchen and reflect on what I'd learned from our conversation. His resistance to my questions hadn't been protective. It had been defensive. He'd acted like someone guarding secrets rather than someone simplifying complexities out of consideration. As I loaded the dishwasher, I found myself wondering what else Mason might be protecting me from understanding. If he'd been wrong about my artistic abilities, if he'd been systematically undermining my confidence in my own judgment, what other aspects of our life together might not be what they seemed? For the first time in 18 years, I felt genuinely curious about the man I'd married. Not curious in the admiring way I'd once been, but curious in the way I'd investigate a character whose motivations didn't quite add up. And I was beginning to suspect that Mason Shaw had been playing a very long game that I was only now learning how to see. Over the next 2 weeks, I became a detective in my own life. Every conversation with Mason became an opportunity to test my growing theory that his protective concern was actually systematic control. Every dismissive comment became evidence in a case I was building against the man I'd trusted for 18 years. I started small, asking innocent questions that any wife might reasonably pose about their shared life. When Mason mentioned a work conference in Denver, I asked which hotel he'd be staying at. His response was vague and slightly irritated, as if my curiosity about his travel arrangements was inappropriate nosiness rather than normal spousal interest. "It's some business hotel downtown," he said, without looking up from his phone. "I don't remember the name. David handles the booking details." When I suggested we should review our insurance policies since we were approaching middle age, Mason's reaction was swift and dismissive. "Our coverage is excellent, Carrie. I've already optimized everything for our situation. There's no need for you to worry about technical policy details." But I wasn't worried, I was curious, and his resistance to my curiosity was becoming a pattern I couldn't ignore. I began paying attention to details I'd previously overlooked. The way Mason's phone was always face down during meals, constantly buzzing with messages he'd glance at but never share. The expensive clothes and accessories that seemed to appear in his wardrobe without explanation. The business dinners that ran increasingly late, sometimes extending past midnight for client relationship building. Most tellingly, I noticed how Mason's mood seemed to correlate with his level of control over our conversations. When I asked direct questions or expressed independent opinions, he became tense and condescending. When I returned to my familiar role of agreeable support, he relaxed and became charming again. One evening, I decided to test this pattern more deliberately. I mentioned that I'd been thinking about redecorating our living room, describing some ideas I'd been developing for updating the space. Mason's response was predictably dismissive. "Carrie, you know interior design isn't really your strength. Remember the disaster with the guest bathroom? We ended up hiring professionals to fix your color choices." But I did remember the guest bathroom project, and my memory didn't match his version. I'd created a beautiful cohesive design that had received compliments from every visitor. The only person who'd criticized it was Mason, who'd nitpicked details until I'd lost confidence in the entire concept. "Maybe I could take some design classes," I suggested, watching his face carefully. "Brush up on current trends and color theory." "Classes?" Mason laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Carrie, you're 42 years old. Don't you think it's time to accept your limitations instead of chasing fantasies about talents you don't actually possess?" The cruelty was so casual, so automatic, that I realized this wasn't about design classes. This was about Mason's need to keep me convinced of my own inadequacy. I began researching emotional abuse online, typing careful search terms into browsers at the public library, where my internet activity couldn't be monitored. What I found was a detailed description of my marriage written by strangers who'd never met Mason or me. Systematic undermining of the victim's confidence. Check. Isolation from supportive relationships. Check. I'd lost touch with most of my college friends and family members over the years, usually after Mason expressed concerns about their negative influence on my personal growth. Financial control and withholding of information. Check. I had no independent access to our accounts, no clear understanding of our financial situation, and no involvement in major monetary decisions. Gaslighting. Making the victim question their own memory and perception of reality. Check, check, check. The clinical descriptions of emotional abuse tactics read like a manual for my marriage. Every strategy was familiar. Every technique was something I'd experienced. Every warning sign was present in my relationship with Mason. But the most chilling discovery was reading about the long-term effects on victims: decreased self-esteem, learned helplessness, difficulty trusting their own judgment, and a gradual erosion of identity until they no longer recognized the person they'd been before the abuse began. I thought about the confident, creative woman I'd been at 24, full of dreams and self-assurance. Then I thought about the woman I'd become: apologetic, uncertain, grateful for scraps of approval from a man who seemed to view my very existence as an inconvenience. Mason hadn't just been wrong about my abilities, he'd been deliberately destroying them. The realization was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant accepting that the man I'd loved had been systematically damaging me for 18 years. Liberating because it meant the problem wasn't my inadequacy, it was his cruelty. I started documenting everything. Conversations where Mason dismissed my opinions, incidents where he rewrote history to make me question my own memory, examples of financial decisions made without my input or knowledge, a pattern of isolation from friends and family who might have offered alternative perspectives on my worth. The evidence was overwhelming. I wasn't living in a marriage. I was living in an elaborate psychological prison designed to keep me small, dependent, and grateful for my captor's attention. But prisons only work if the prisoner doesn't realize they're incarcerated. And I was finally beginning to understand that the door had never actually been locked. 3 weeks into my investigation of my own marriage, I made a discovery that changed everything. I was doing laundry, something I'd done faithfully every Wednesday for 18 years, when I found a receipt in Mason's jacket pocket. The Meridian Hotel, downtown, room service for 2, champagne and strawberries. The date was last Tuesday, when Mason had claimed to be in meetings until nearly midnight. My hands trembled as I stared at the small piece of paper that destroyed the last of my illusions about my marriage. The emotional abuse had been devastating enough, but this was different. This was concrete proof that while Mason had been systematically destroying my self-worth, he'd also been betraying me in the most fundamental way possible. I sat on our bedroom floor, surrounded by his expensive clothes that I'd been dutifully caring for, and felt something crack open inside my chest. Not my heart breaking, that had been happening slowly for 18 years. This was something deeper, the final shattering of my willingness to make excuses for him. But I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I did what I'd learned to do over the past month. I investigated. I began paying attention to Mason's schedule with forensic precision. The late nights that had become increasingly frequent, the business trips that seemed oddly timed, the new cologne he'd started wearing, the way he'd become protective of his phone, taking it with him even to the bathroom. I noticed how he'd started working out more regularly, updating his wardrobe with younger, trendier clothes, how he'd begun getting expensive haircuts, and had recently bought contact lenses to replace the glasses he'd worn for years. These weren't the behaviors of a man focused on his career advancement. These were the behaviors of a man trying to impress someone new. Over the following week, I found more evidence. Credit card statements showing dinners at expensive restaurants I'd never been to, charges for jewelry from stores I'd never heard of, a florist bill for arrangements that had never appeared in our home. Each discovery was like another weight added to a scale that had been tipping toward truth for weeks. Mason wasn't just emotionally abusive, he was actively deceiving me while spending our money on someone else. The cruelest part was remembering all the times he'd criticized my spending. When I'd wanted to take art classes, he'd lectured me about being fiscally responsible. When I'd suggested we update our outdated furniture, he'd explained why such expenses were impractical. When I'd asked for a small budget for personal purchases, he'd made me feel selfish for wanting anything beyond basic necessities. But apparently, champagne and jewelry for his mistress were perfectly reasonable expenses. I found myself wondering how long it had been going on. Were the late nights and business trips always cover stories for his affair? Had he been living a double life for months, years, while I'd been home feeling grateful for his support and protection? The questions consumed me. I started checking our credit card statements more carefully, looking for patterns I'd previously ignored. I found charges dating back over a year to restaurants, hotels, and boutiques that painted a clear picture of an ongoing relationship. Mason had been methodically betraying me while simultaneously convincing me that I was lucky to have him, that I was too incompetent to survive without his guidance, that I should be grateful for his patience with my limitations. The psychological manipulation was almost worse than the affair itself. He'd been systematically destroying my confidence while living a secret life funded by our joint resources. He'd made me feel small and worthless while treating another woman to romantic dinners and expensive gifts. But as I sat there surrounded by evidence of his betrayal, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling devastated, I felt clear. For the first time in 18 years, I had absolute clarity about my situation. Mason Shaw was not a good man who'd made mistakes. He was not a loving husband who'd grown distant. He was a manipulative, cruel person who'd spent nearly 2 decades systematically damaging my psyche while betraying our marriage. I thought about all the times I'd blamed myself for our problems. All the times I'd wondered what was wrong with me that I couldn't make him happy. All the times I'd accepted his criticism as constructive feedback rather than deliberate cruelty. The affair wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage vows. It was proof that everything else had been calculated deception. A man who truly believed I was incompetent and worthless wouldn't need to work so hard to convince me of those things. A man who was genuinely concerned about my limitations wouldn't systematically prevent me from discovering my strengths. Mason had been deliberately keeping me broken because broken women don't leave, broken women don't question, broken women don't investigate hotel receipts and credit card statements and start piecing together the truth about their marriages. But I wasn't broken anymore. And I was definitely going to leave. That night, for the first time in months, I slept peacefully. Not because my problems were solved, but because I finally understood exactly what my problems were. And problems that can be clearly identified can usually be solved. Mason had underestimated the woman he'd been systematically undermining for 18 years. He was about to discover just how costly that mistake would be. The discovery of Mason's affair became the catalyst for the most strategic 3 months of my life. But unlike the emotional breakdown he would have expected if I'd confronted him immediately, I chose a different path, careful methodical planning executed while maintaining the facade of the dutiful, oblivious wife he believed me to be. The performance required every acting skill I'd never known I possessed. Every morning I had to wake up next to a man I now saw clearly as my enemy and pretend nothing had changed. Every evening, I had to listen to his lies about late meetings and business dinners while knowing he was describing time spent with another woman. Every conversation required me to play the role of someone who still believed in his version of our reality. But the performance was also liberating. For the first time in 18 years, I felt like I was in control of something important. Mason thought he was managing my perceptions, but I was managing his entire understanding of my capabilities and intentions. I began with the practical necessities. I opened a checking account at a different bank using my maiden name, telling the banker I was starting a small freelance design business and needed to separate my professional finances. I started a small graphic design practice online, taking on simple logo projects and website layouts that I could complete during Mason's long workdays. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Mason spent our evenings convincing me I had no artistic talent, I was earning money proving him wrong. Each completed project validated my abilities and added to my secret escape fund. I researched divorce attorneys with the same thoroughness I'd once applied to college research projects. I read reviews, checked their track records with high-asset divorces, and identified lawyers who specialized in cases involving financial manipulation and emotional abuse. I scheduled consultations during Mason's business trips, telling each attorney I was gathering information for a friend who was in an abusive marriage. The consultations were educational in ways I hadn't anticipated. I learned about financial discovery processes, about documentation requirements for proving abuse, about strategies for protecting assets and establishing independent credit. I learned that emotional abuse was increasingly recognized by family courts, especially when it could be documented through patterns of financial control and systematic isolation. Most importantly, I learned that I had legal options I'd never known existed. I began documenting everything with the precision of a legal professional. I kept a detailed journal of Mason's manipulative comments, his dismissive behaviors, his efforts to undermine my confidence. I photographed credit card statements showing his affair-related expenses. I saved voicemails where his tone shifted from charming to condescending depending on whether I was agreeing with him or expressing independent thoughts. I researched our financial situation more thoroughly than Mason would have believed possible. I found account statements he'd hidden, investment portfolios I'd never known about, and financial arrangements that had been made without any input from me. I discovered that we were significantly wealthier than Mason had ever indicated, which explained how he could afford his expensive affair while claiming we needed to be cautious about household expenses. The most crucial part of my preparation was rebuilding my support network. I reached out to old friends Mason had encouraged me to distance myself from over the years. I reconnected with my sister Abby, apologizing for the years of reduced contact, and gradually explaining my situation. I joined a support group for women in emotionally abusive relationships, using a different name and meeting them in a neighboring town where Mason would never think to look for me. Each conversation with supportive people reinforced what I was beginning to understand. The woman Mason had convinced me I was bore no resemblance to the woman I actually was. My friends remembered me as confident, creative, and intelligent. My sister reminded me of achievements Mason had trained me to minimize. The support group helped me recognize patterns of abuse I'd been conditioned to accept as normal. I started physical preparation as well. I began working out regularly, not for Mason's approval but for my own strength and confidence. I updated my wardrobe with clothes that reflected my own taste rather than Mason's preferences. I got a new haircut that made me feel like myself for the first time in years. Mason noticed some of these changes, but interpreted them through his usual lens of condescension. When he commented on my new exercise routine, he suggested I was probably going through a midlife phase and shouldn't overdo it. When he saw my new clothes, he warned me not to spend too much money on fashion experiments that might not suit me. His dismissive responses only reinforced my determination. Every patronizing comment reminded me why I was leaving. Every attempt to undermine my confidence provided more evidence for my documentation. Every lie about his whereabouts gave me more time to prepare for my escape. 3 months after finding that hotel receipt, I had everything in place: legal representation, financial independence, comprehensive documentation of abuse, and a clear plan for my new life. I had transformed from a woman who apologized for existing into someone who was prepared to fight for her freedom. Mason had no idea that the submissive wife he'd created was about to disappear forever. But first, I had to let him make one final mistake that would give me the perfect opportunity to reveal exactly how much he'd underestimated me. My opportunity came in the form of Mason's own arrogance. 3 months into my secret preparation, he made the mistake of leaving his laptop open on our kitchen counter while he took a shower. For 18 years, that laptop had been as off-limits as a classified government file. Mason guarded it obsessively, never letting it out of his sight, always closing it when I entered the room. But success in his double life had made him careless. I had maybe 15 minutes before he'd finish his shower and come looking for his precious device. I moved quickly but methodically, photographing screen after screen of information that painted a devastating picture of Mason's secret activities. What I found went far beyond a simple affair. Mason wasn't just cheating on me, he was systematically defrauding his clients at Clyde Financial Services. Email chains showed him moving client funds into personal investment accounts, skimming fees that were never disclosed, and creating fake portfolio statements to hide his theft. The amounts were staggering: over $2 million diverted from retiree accounts, pension funds, and college savings plans. His mistress, I discovered, was named Samantha Clyde, the daughter of his business partner David. She wasn't just an affair, she was an active participant in the fraud scheme, using her position as a junior associate to access client accounts and manipulate records. The email exchanges between them were nauseating. They mocked their elderly clients as easy marks and celebrated successful thefts like they were legitimate business victories. They discussed expensive vacations funded by stolen retirement money and laughed about the suckers who trusted them with their life savings. But the emails that cut deepest were the ones about me. The wife still doesn't suspect anything, Mason had written to Samantha. She's too stupid to understand basic finances anyway. I've spent 18 years convincing her she's incompetent, and she believes every word. Samantha's response was equally cruel. It's almost sad how pathetic she is. Grateful for scraps of attention from a man who can barely stand to be in the same room with her. At least she serves a purpose, perfect cover for our activities. They'd been using my ignorance as camouflage for their crimes. While I'd been home feeling grateful for Mason's financial management, he'd been stealing millions of dollars and using our marriage as his alibi for respectability. I photographed everything: bank statements, client lists, evidence of forged documents, proof of money laundering through shell companies. I captured the emails discussing their criminal activities and their contemptuous discussions of me. I documented a paper trail that would put both of them in federal prison for decades. As I heard the shower turn off upstairs, I closed the laptop and returned to the living room, my heart pounding but my mind crystal clear. I now had evidence of crimes that dwarfed the emotional abuse I'd endured. Mason wasn't just a manipulative husband, he was a federal criminal who'd been using our marriage as cover for a massive fraud operation, but I couldn't go to the authorities as myself. If I reported Mason directly, he'd know I was the source, and I wasn't ready for that confrontation yet. I needed to maintain my cover while the investigation unfolded, gathering more evidence while he remained unaware of his exposure. That afternoon, I drove to a town 40 miles away and used a payphone outside an old diner to call the FBI's financial crimes hotline. I'd researched the process carefully, knowing that anonymous tips about financial fraud were taken seriously when they included specific, verifiable information. I want to report a major financial fraud scheme, I told the agent who answered. Multiple victims, millions in stolen retirement funds, ongoing criminal activity. I provided detailed information about Mason's operation, client names, account numbers, specific dates of fraudulent transactions. I described the shell companies, the fake statements, the systematic theft from elderly clients who trusted him with their life savings. This is very specific information, the agent observed. Are you involved in the company in some way? I have access to evidence, I replied carefully. But I need to remain anonymous for my own protection. These people are dangerous, and I'm afraid of retaliation. I arranged to send encrypted files containing the photographs I'd taken, using a secure server the FBI provided. Within hours, federal investigators would have comprehensive evidence of Mason's crimes, complete with financial records and email correspondence proving intent to defraud. We take these cases very seriously, the agent assured me. If your information checks out, we'll begin an investigation immediately. As I drove home, I felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and terror. I'd just set in motion events that would destroy Mason's entire world, his career, his freedom, his carefully constructed facade of respectability. There would be no recovery from federal fraud charges, no way to charm his way out of decades of systematic theft. But I'd also crossed a line I could never uncross. I was no longer just a wife planning to divorce her abusive husband. I was a federal informant whose actions would send the father of someone's children to prison for the rest of his life. Yet as I thought about all the elderly clients who'd trusted Mason with their retirement savings, all the families who'd believed in his integrity, all the dreams that had been shattered by his greed, I felt no regret. Mason had built his fortune on lies and theft. It was time for the truth to collect its due. The morning I planned to serve Mason with divorce papers, he woke up in an unusually cheerful mood. He hummed while he shaved, wore his most expensive suit, and actually attempted conversation during breakfast. He was probably celebrating some recent success in his criminal enterprise, or planning another romantic getaway with Samantha, completely unaware that federal agents were already building a case that would destroy everything he'd stolen. You seem happy, I observed, watching him butter his toast with the same precise movements he used for everything in his controlled little world. Just feeling optimistic about some new opportunities, he replied, that familiar condescending smile playing at his lips. Big developments at the firm. David and I are about to close some very lucrative deals. Big developments indeed. I wondered if he'd still be smiling when those deals became evidence in his federal prosecution. Mason checked his phone constantly throughout breakfast. typing responses with the kind of urgent intensity that suggested important communications with his co-conspirators. His confidence was almost painful to watch, knowing what was coming for him. "Actually," he said, setting down his phone and looking at me with sudden focus, "I've been thinking about something important. Maybe it's time we had a serious conversation about your future." My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. "My future?" "Well, you've been going through some kind of phase lately," Mason continued, his tone gentle but patronizing. "All this talk about photography classes, the questions about our finances, the sudden interest in things that have never concerned you before. It's like you're trying to be someone you're not." Here it came. The speech I'd heard variations of for 18 years, the systematic dismantling of my confidence designed to keep me grateful for his management of my life. "I think you're having what people call a midlife crisis," Mason explained, as if he were a doctor delivering a diagnosis. "It's completely normal for women your age to start questioning their choices, to wonder if they missed out on something. But it's important to be realistic about your actual capabilities." Realistic about my capabilities. The phrase that had haunted me for nearly 2 decades. The constant reminder that I was fortunate to have someone who understood my limitations better than I did. "What I'm trying to say," Mason continued, reaching across the table to pat my hand in that condescending way I'd once found comforting, "is that you need to accept who you are instead of chasing fantasies about who you think you could become." The irony was staggering. While Mason lectured me about accepting reality, he was living in a complete delusion about his own invincibility. While he warned me against unrealistic expectations, he was stealing millions of dollars and believing he'd never face consequences. "You're probably right," I said, giving him the submissive agreement he expected. "I have been feeling a bit lost lately." Relief flooded Mason's features. He loved nothing more than a wife who recognized her place and appreciated his guidance. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said, his voice taking on that patronizing tone he used when he felt particularly magnanimous. "That's what I'm here for, to help you stay grounded in reality. Some people are dreamers, and some people are doers. There's nothing wrong with being a dreamer, as long as you understand your limitations." Dreamers and doers, as if the two categories were mutually exclusive, as if creativity automatically meant incompetence, as if the woman sitting across from him hadn't spent 3 months methodically building a federal case against him while he remained completely oblivious. "I've been thinking we should take a vacation," Mason announced, obviously pleased with his successful management of my midlife crisis. "Somewhere relaxing where you can get back to focusing on the things that actually matter. Maybe that little bed and breakfast in Vermont you used to like." The suggestion was revealing. Mason wanted to isolate me from whatever influences he thought were causing my recent independence. A quiet weekend, where he could reinforce my dependence and remind me why I needed his protection from my own poor judgment. "That sounds nice," I replied, knowing I'd be long gone before any such trip could materialize. Mason's phone buzzed again, and his attention immediately shifted back to his secret communications. Probably Samantha updating him on their latest theft or planning their next romantic encounter. He responded with the kind of focused intensity that suggested urgent criminal coordination. "I have important meetings today," he announced, gathering his things with the self-important efficiency he'd perfected over the years. "Some deals that could set us up very well for the future." Our future. The presumption that we would continue to have a shared future, that I would remain his grateful dependent while he continued his criminal career, was breathtaking in its arrogance. "I probably won't be home until late," Mason continued, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. "These negotiations are complex, requiring the kind of sophisticated thinking that most people can't handle." Most people meaning me, of course. The wife who was too simple to understand his important work, too limited to participate in significant decisions, too naive to suspect that her husband was a federal criminal. As Mason headed for the door, he paused and turned back with that expression that always preceded his most devastating psychological attacks. "And Carrie," he said, his voice carrying that familiar edge of gentle cruelty, "let's not have any more conversations about photography classes or financial matters, or other things that are beyond your understanding. I know you're trying to grow, but some limitations are permanent. I'm just trying to protect you from embarrassing yourself." The door closed behind him with that same aggressive force he'd been using for 18 years, leaving me alone in the sudden silence of our kitchen. But this time, his dismissive exit felt like liberation rather than abandonment. Because Mason Shaw had just delivered his final lecture about my limitations to a woman who was about to show him exactly how wrong he'd been about everything. 2 hours after Mason left for his important meetings, I sat in my kitchen with 3 envelopes spread before me on the same table where he'd just finished lecturing me about my limitations. The first contained divorce papers, filed that morning and signed with my full legal name, Carrie York, for the first time in 18 years. The second held copies of every piece of evidence I'd gathered about his financial crimes. The third contained something Mason would never expect: documentation of my secret business ventures that had earned me enough money to be financially independent. At 10:30 a.m., exactly as scheduled, my moving truck arrived. I'd planned this moment with military precision. The movers were professionals who specialized in discreet relocations for women leaving abusive situations. They worked quickly and efficiently, removing 18 years of my life from Mason's carefully controlled environment in under 3 hours. I took only what was legally mine: my personal belongings, family heirlooms, and the artwork I'd created during those brief periods when Mason had been too distracted by his criminal activities to monitor my creative pursuits. I left behind every gift he'd given me, every piece of furniture we'd selected together, every symbol of the life I'd been performing rather than living. The movers were loading the last boxes when my phone rang. Mason's name appeared on the screen, and I realized he must have come home early to check on me, probably suspicious about my calm acceptance of his morning lecture. "Hello, Mason," I answered, my voice steady. "Where the hell are you?" His tone was sharp with panic. "There's a moving truck in our driveway, and half the house is empty." "I'm at my new apartment," I replied calmly. "I moved out this morning." The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "What are you talking about?" Mason's voice had shifted to that dangerous tone I knew well, the one that usually preceded his most vicious psychological attacks. "Carrie, if this is some kind of dramatic gesture because of our conversation this morning, it's not a gesture, Mason. I've filed for divorce." Another silence, this one filled with the sound of Mason's world beginning to crack. "You've what?" He was trying to maintain his authoritative tone, but I could hear the fear creeping in. "Carrie, you can't just file for divorce. You don't understand the legal implications, the financial complications. You need to discuss these things with me before making decisions you're not qualified to make." Even in crisis, he defaulted to the same pattern, questioning my competence, asserting his authority, positioning himself as the rational adult managing an irrational child. "Actually, I understand the implications perfectly," I said. "I've been working with an attorney for 3 months. Everything has been thoroughly planned and properly executed." 3 months? The disbelief in his voice was almost comical. "That's impossible. You don't have the organizational skills to plan something like this. You couldn't coordinate a move without my help." There it was. Even while his marriage was collapsing around him, Mason remained convinced that I was too incompetent to have orchestrated my own escape. "I'm more capable than you ever imagined," I replied, feeling a surge of satisfaction at finally speaking this truth aloud. "Carrie, listen to me carefully," Mason said, his voice dropping to that manipulative tone he used when he needed to regain control. "You're making a terrible mistake. You can't survive on your own. You have no income, no practical life skills, no understanding of how the real world works. You'll be back within a week, begging me to take you back." The assessment that might have destroyed me 6 months ago now felt like proof of how completely he'd misunderstood the woman he'd been married to for 18 years. "Actually, Mason, I've been running a successful graphic design business for the past 4 months. I have sufficient income to support myself, and I understand the real world far better than you think." "That's impossible," he said flatly. "You don't have the talent for professional design work. I've told you repeatedly that your artistic abilities aren't commercial quality." "You've told me many things that turned out to be lies," I replied. "About my abilities, about your work, about your late nights and business trips." I could practically hear him processing this, trying to understand how his carefully managed wife had developed the capability to investigate his activities. "What do you mean about my work?" His voice had become very quiet, very careful. "I mean, I know about the stolen client funds, Mason. I know about the fake statements, the shell companies, the money laundering. I know about Samantha Clyde and your partnership in defrauding retirees." The silence that followed was different from the others. This wasn't shock or disbelief. This was the sound of a man realizing that his entire carefully constructed world was about to collapse. "I don't know what you think you've discovered," Mason said finally. But his voice lacked its usual confidence. "But you're obviously misunderstanding complex financial arrangements that are beyond your comprehension." "I'm not misunderstanding anything," I said. "And neither will the FBI when they receive the comprehensive evidence I've compiled about your criminal enterprise." "The FBI?" Now Mason's voice cracked completely. "Carrie, what have you done?" "I've done what you always said I was too stupid to do," I replied. "I've solved a complex problem through careful analysis and strategic action. I've protected innocent people from a criminal who was stealing their life savings. And I've finally stopped accepting your version of who I am." "You can't prove anything," Mason said, but the desperation in his voice suggested he knew otherwise. "Actually, I can prove everything. 18 years of marriage taught me one valuable skill, Mason. I learned to be very, very thorough when documenting the truth." The call ended with Mason shouting threats and accusations, but I barely heard them. For the first time in 18 years, his words had no power over me. I was finally free. Within 30 minutes of our phone call, Mason was pounding on the door of my new apartment. I watched through the peephole as he stood in the hallway, his expensive suit wrinkled, his perfect hair disheveled, his face contorted with a rage I'd never seen before. The composed, condescending man who'd lectured me about my limitations that morning had been replaced by someone desperate and dangerous. "Open this door, Carrie," he shouted, his voice echoing through the hallway. "We need to talk about this insanity immediately." I didn't open the door. Instead, I called my attorney, Rebecca Shaw, a woman who specialized in high-conflict divorces and had seen Mason's type many times before. She'd warned me that abusive men often escalated their behavior when they lost control, and she'd helped me prepare for exactly this scenario. "He's here," I told her quietly, staying away from the door. "Just like you predicted. Are you safe? Do you need me to call the police?" "I'm safe for now. The building has security, and he can't get past the lobby without a key card. But he's not going away." Mason's pounding intensified, and I heard him trying the door handle repeatedly. "Carrie, I know you're in there. This is ridiculous. You can't just disappear and refuse to discuss this like adults." Like adults. The phrase was rich coming from a man who was having a public tantrum in an apartment hallway because his wife had finally developed a spine. "I'm going to send someone to document his behavior," Rebecca said. "Keep recording everything. His reaction to losing control will be valuable evidence for our case." I started recording on my phone, capturing Mason's increasingly unhinged demands and threats. The polished, sophisticated businessman he presented to the world was disintegrating in real time, revealing the entitled, controlling man I'd lived with for 18 years. "You think you're so smart?" Mason yelled through the door. "You think you can just walk away from everything I've built for us? You don't have the intelligence or the strength to survive without me." The irony was staggering. While Mason screamed about my inadequacies from a public hallway, I was calmly coordinating with legal professionals, managing a crisis he couldn't handle, and demonstrating exactly the kind of competence he'd spent years convincing me I didn't possess. After 20 minutes of his ranting, building security arrived. I watched through the peephole as 2 uniformed guards approached Mason with professional calm. "Sir, we've had complaints about the disturbance," one of them said. "We need you to leave the premises immediately." Mason's response was predictably arrogant. "Do you know who I am? I'm Mason Shaw from Clyde Financial Services. This is my wife's apartment, and I have every right to speak with her." "Actually, sir, you don't," the guard replied. "This is a private building, and you're not on the resident's approved visitor list. You need to leave now, or we'll call the police." I could see Mason's face through the peephole, and the entitled fury there was more revealing than 18 years of marriage had been. This was who he really was when his careful control was stripped away. A man who believed rules didn't apply to him, that his professional status gave him the right to intimidate and dominate. "This is harassment," Mason shouted as the guards escorted him toward the elevator. "I'm being denied access to my own wife by hired security. This is going to cost someone their job." Even while being forcibly removed from the building, Mason was threatening people's livelihoods, trying to use his perceived power to punish anyone who didn't submit to his demands. My phone rang as soon as Mason was escorted out. His name appeared on the screen, and I debated whether to answer. Rebecca had advised me to document all contact, so I accepted the call but didn't speak first. "This is insane, Carrie," Mason said, his voice now shifting to the manipulative tone he used when aggression failed. "You're destroying our entire life over some misunderstanding. Whatever you think you know about my work, you're wrong. You don't understand complex financial arrangements." "I understand theft, Mason. I understand fraud. I understand that you've been stealing from elderly clients while convincing me I was too stupid to manage our household budget." "You're being hysterical," he said, defaulting to another classic manipulation tactic. "You're emotional and confused, and you're making decisions that will ruin both our lives. Come home, and we'll discuss this rationally." "I am home," I replied. "This is my home now, and there's nothing to discuss. The divorce papers are filed, the evidence is with federal authorities, and I'm done being managed by someone who views me as a burden rather than a partner." "Federal authorities?" Mason's voice cracked again. "Carrie, you don't understand what you're doing. You could be charged as an accessory if you've been involved in reporting legitimate business activities as crimes." The threat was so transparent, so desperately manipulative, that I almost laughed. Even facing the collapse of his criminal enterprise, Mason was trying to convince me that I was the one in legal jeopardy. "I've been very careful to establish my innocence, Mason. My attorney and the FBI both understand that I was deliberately excluded from your financial activities. I'm a victim of your crimes, not an accomplice." "You can't prove any of this," Mason said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I've already proven it. Bank records, email correspondence, client files, everything is documented and verified. Your criminal partnership with Samantha Clyde is fully exposed." The mention of Samantha's name triggered another explosion of rage. "How dare you spy on my private communications? That's invasion of privacy. That's illegal surveillance. Actually, photographing evidence of crimes isn't illegal. It's called being a responsible citizen." The call ended with Mason screaming threats about legal action, financial ruin, and social destruction. But his words felt hollow now, like echoes from a past I'd finally escaped. For 18 years, Mason's anger had been my signal to apologize, to retreat, to make myself smaller until his rage subsided. Now it was simply confirmation that I'd made the right decision. The man who'd convinced me I was too weak to survive without him was having a complete breakdown because I'd proven him wrong about everything. 3 days after I served Mason with divorce papers, the FBI raided Clyde Financial Services at 8:47 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. I wasn't there to witness it, but the local news covered the story extensively, and I watched from my new apartment as federal agents carried boxes of evidence out of the building where Mason had spent 15 years perfecting his criminal enterprise. Federal authorities have arrested 2 individuals in connection with a multi-million-dollar investment fraud scheme, the news anchor reported. Mason Shaw and Samantha Clyde of Clyde Financial Services are accused of systematically stealing from client accounts over a period of several years. The footage showed Mason being led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit and perfectly styled hair looking absurd against the harsh reality of federal custody. The confident, condescending man who'd lectured me about my limitations just days earlier now looked small and frightened, surrounded by FBI agents who weren't impressed by his professional credentials or social status. Samantha Clyde was arrested at her luxury apartment, the one Mason's stolen money had helped furnish. The news showed her covering her face with a designer handbag as agents escorted her to a waiting vehicle, her youth and beauty offering no protection against the consequences of her choices. My phone rang within hours of the arrests. Rebecca, my attorney, was calling with updates about the investigation and its impact on our divorce proceedings. The federal charges actually strengthen our case significantly, she explained. Mason's criminal activities establish a pattern of deception and financial abuse that extends beyond your marriage. The court will view his systematic theft as evidence of his character and his willingness to betray people who trusted him. What happens to the stolen money? I asked, thinking about the elderly clients who'd trusted Mason with their retirement savings. The FBI has frozen all assets connected to the scheme. Eventually, there will be a restitution process to return stolen funds to victims. But it's a complex procedure that can take years to complete. I thought about Mrs. Henderson, the sweet elderly woman who'd trusted Mason with her late husband's pension, about the young couple who'd invested their children's college fund with him, about all the people who'd believed in his professional integrity while he was systematically robbing them. I want to help, I said. I have documentation that might assist with victim restitution. Financial records that could help identify exactly how much was stolen from each client. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Carrie, you should know that cooperating with federal investigators might expose you to additional scrutiny. Are you prepared for that level of involvement? I'm prepared for whatever it takes to make this right, I replied. These people trusted Mason, and he betrayed that trust. If my evidence can help them recover their stolen money, then I want to provide it. The next morning, I met with Special Agent Lisa York, no relation, despite the shared surname, at the FBI field office downtown. She was a financial crimes specialist who'd been investigating white-collar fraud for over a decade, and she treated me with the kind of professional respect I'd forgotten existed. Mrs. Shaw, she began, then caught herself. I'm sorry, Ms. York. Your anonymous tip was invaluable to our investigation. The evidence you provided allowed us to move quickly before more money could be stolen or hidden offshore. I'm glad I could help, I said, but I want to do more than just provide evidence. I want to understand how this happened, how Mason was able to deceive so many people for so long. Agent York spread several documents across the conference table, showing me the scope of Mason's criminal operation. Your husband was very sophisticated in his approach. He targeted clients who trusted him completely, elderly individuals, recent widows, people who weren't comfortable managing their own investments. The pattern was familiar. Mason had used the same techniques on his clients that he'd used on me, establishing himself as the expert, convincing them they were incapable of understanding complex matters, and gradually taking complete control of their financial decisions. He made them feel stupid for asking questions, I observed, studying the client profiles. Exactly. He convinced them that their concerns were naive, that their instincts were wrong, that they should be grateful for his superior knowledge. It's a classic pattern in financial abuse cases. Financial abuse. The term perfectly described what Mason had done to me for 18 years, and apparently to dozens of other people who'd trusted him with their money and their futures. The good news, Agent York continued, is that your documentation has helped us trace most of the stolen funds. We've identified the shell companies, the offshore accounts, and the fake investment vehicles Mason used to hide the money. Recovery will take time, but we're confident that most victims will eventually get their money back. As I left the FBI office that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pride in my own capabilities. The same analytical skills Mason had dismissed as worthless had been instrumental in bringing down his criminal enterprise. The attention to detail he'd mocked as obsessive had provided federal investigators with the evidence they needed to protect future victims. The woman Mason had convinced was too stupid to understand his work had been smart enough to document his crimes and brave enough to report them to federal authorities. His assessment of my limitations had been wrong about everything. But his victims would get justice, and that was worth every moment of fear, every day of careful planning, every risk I'd taken to escape his control. Mason Shaw had finally faced someone he couldn't manipulate, couldn't dismiss, and couldn't intimidate into silence. And that someone was the wife he'd spent 18 years trying to destroy. 6 weeks after Mason's arrest, I received a call that added a layer of poetic justice to his downfall that even I couldn't have scripted. Special Agent York was calling with an update that would have been laughable if it weren't so perfectly fitting. "Miss York, I thought you'd want to know about a development in your ex-husband's case," she said, her voice carrying what sounded suspiciously like amusement. "We've discovered that Mason Shaw was keeping extraordinarily detailed records of all his criminal activities." "What do you mean?" I asked, settling into my new apartment's comfortable reading chair, a piece of furniture I'd chosen entirely for my own taste rather than anyone else's approval. "I mean, he documented everything. Every fraudulent transaction, every client he deceived, every dollar he stole. He kept spreadsheets tracking his illegal profits, emails outlining his criminal strategies, even voice recordings of conversations where he and Samantha Clyde discussed their schemes." The irony was breathtaking. Why would he document his own crimes so thoroughly? That's what we wondered too. So we asked him during his interrogation. Agent York paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. According to Shaw, he was convinced that David Clyde was planning to betray him and take all the stolen money. So he kept detailed records as insurance, evidence he could use against Clyde if their partnership fell apart. Mason's paranoia and need for control had become the instruments of his own destruction. The man who'd spent 18 years convincing me I was too disorganized to manage simple tasks had been compulsively documenting every aspect of his criminal enterprise. "But here's the really interesting part," Agent York continued. "When we confronted Shaw with his own documentation, his response was that you must have planted the evidence somehow. He insisted that you were too incompetent to have discovered his activities on your own. Even facing federal prison, even confronted with his own handwriting and voice recordings, Mason remained convinced that I was incapable of the intelligence and planning that had brought him down. His delusion about my inadequacy was so complete that he'd rather believe in an impossible conspiracy than accept that his stupid wife had outsmarted him. He actually told investigators that you don't have the technical skills to access computer files or the analytical ability to understand complex financial crimes," Agent York said. "He claimed someone else must have been helping you, a lover, a private investigator, maybe even law enforcement." The assessment was vintage Mason. Rather than acknowledge that he'd systematically underestimated my capabilities for 2 decades, he'd invented elaborate theories to explain how someone as limited as he believed me to be could have gathered evidence against him. "What's his legal situation now?" I asked. "Not good. His own documentation makes prosecution straightforward. We have his handwritten notes describing which clients would be easy targets for theft. We have emails where he bragged about stealing retirement funds. We have recordings where he and Samantha Clyde celebrated successful frauds." Agent York explained that Mason's meticulous record-keeping had eliminated any possibility of claiming the thefts were accidental or misunderstood. His own words proved criminal intent, deliberate deception, and callous disregard for his victims. His attorney is trying to negotiate a plea deal, but the evidence is so overwhelming that prosecutors aren't offering much. Shaw is looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison, minimum 15 to 20 years. I tried to imagine Mason, with his obsession with professional status and social respectability, spending the next 2 decades in federal custody. The man who'd built his identity around being superior to everyone else would be reduced to a number in the prison system. "There's one more thing," Agent York said. "Shaw's been asking to speak with you. He seems to believe he can convince you to recant your testimony or claim you misunderstood what you discovered." The request was so typically Mason that I almost laughed. Even from jail, even facing overwhelming evidence of his guilt, he remained convinced that he could manipulate me back into submission. He still believed I was the confused, dependent woman he'd spent 18 years creating. "I have no interest in speaking with him," I said firmly. "But I am curious about something. How is he handling prison?" "Not well," Agent York replied. According to his cellmate, Shaw spends most of his time explaining to anyone who'll listen that he's the victim of a massive misunderstanding. He claims his wife was too stupid to understand legitimate business practices and accidentally reported normal financial activities as crimes. Even in prison, Mason was telling the same story he'd been telling for 18 years, that I was too incompetent to understand reality, too limited to recognize my own mistakes, too naive to function without his guidance. The man whose own documentation had convicted him remained convinced that I was the confused one. "Agent York," I said, "please make sure the prosecution knows that I'll testify at trial if needed." Mason Shaw spent 18 years convincing me I was worthless, and I want his victims to see that he was wrong about everything. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Mason's downfall wasn't just about justice for his financial crimes. It was about the ultimate validation of every instinct he'd taught me to doubt, every opinion he'd dismissed as worthless, every capability he'd convinced me I didn't possess. The woman he'd systematically destroyed had become the architect of his destruction, and he still couldn't see how that was possible. 1 year after signing those divorce papers, I stood in the gallery space of my own design studio, surrounded by work that proved everything Mason had been wrong about. The opening reception for my first solo exhibition was in full swing, and I watched clients, colleagues, and friends admire the creative work he'd spent 18 years convincing me I was incapable of producing. The studio itself was a testament to capabilities I'd forgotten I possessed. Clean lines, sophisticated color schemes, and innovative spatial solutions that had earned recognition from the design community and attracted a steady stream of high-end clients. The business that had started as a secret escape fund had evolved into something far beyond what I'd imagined possible. "Carrie, the response to your rebranding campaign for Henderson Industries has been incredible," said Clara Martinez, my former college professor, who'd become both a mentor and friend again. "Their sales increased 40% in the first quarter after the launch. You've definitely found your niche in corporate identity design, Henderson Industries." The irony wasn't lost on me that one of my most successful projects involved rebranding a company whose trust Mason had violated. They'd hired me specifically because they needed someone who understood the importance of authentic professional integrity, something their previous financial advisor had clearly lacked. "I never thought I'd be grateful for 18 years of marriage to a criminal," I said, adjusting one of the portfolio displays, "but understanding corporate fraud from the inside gave me unique insights into how businesses need to rebuild trust." My specialization in crisis communication and reputation rehabilitation had developed organically from my own experience. Companies that had suffered breaches of trust, executives who needed to rebuild credibility, organizations recovering from scandal, they all needed someone who understood how systematic deception worked and how authentic transparency could restore confidence. The work was challenging, creative, and personally meaningful in ways I'd never expected.
"Miss York,"
A young woman approached with the kind of nervous energy I recognized from my own early career.
"Hi, Abby Chen, a graphic design student at the university."
Professor Martinez suggested I introduce myself. "I'm working on my senior thesis about women who restart their careers after major life changes." Abby Chen. The surname gave me pause. I wondered if she was related to Mason's former partner in crime, Samantha Clyde, who'd reverted to her maiden name after her conviction. But this young woman radiated the kind of genuine enthusiasm and integrity that Samantha had never possessed. "I'd be happy to talk with you about career transitions," I said, "but I should mention that my story involves some difficult circumstances. Domestic abuse, financial fraud, federal investigations. It's not a typical professional journey." "That's exactly why I want to hear it," Abby replied earnestly. "I'm researching how women rebuild their professional identities after escaping controlling relationships. Your story represents hope for women who think it's too late to discover their real potential." Over the following weeks, I found myself sharing my experience more openly than I'd ever intended. The interview with Abby led to speaking engagements at women's shelters, articles in business magazines about financial abuse, and eventually a consulting practice focused specifically on helping women rebuild their careers after leaving abusive relationships. The support group I joined during my marriage had evolved into something larger, a nonprofit organization providing resources, mentorship, and financial assistance to women escaping emotional and economic abuse. I served on the board, using my business experience to help other women develop the practical skills they needed for independence. "You know what I find most remarkable about your story," said Dr. Sarah Clyde, a therapist who worked with our organization and had no relation to Mason's criminal partners despite the shared surname. It's not just that you escaped an abusive marriage, it's that you recognized your own worth clearly enough to take such significant risks to preserve it. She was right. The decision to document Mason's crimes and report them to federal authorities had required a level of self-respect I'd thought was permanently damaged. It meant believing that I deserved better treatment, that my judgment was sound, that my life had value worth protecting. The woman Mason thought he'd created would never have had the courage to challenge him. I agreed. She would have stayed small, stayed grateful, stayed silent about everything she suspected but couldn't prove. But that woman was never real, Dr. Clyde pointed out. She was a performance you gave because you thought it was necessary for survival. Your real strength was always there, you just needed circumstances that allowed you to access it. On quiet evenings in my apartment, I sometimes thought about Mason serving his 15-year sentence in federal prison. According to Agent York, he'd continued insisting throughout his trial that I was too incompetent to have gathered evidence against him. His own attorney had eventually stopped trying to convince him that underestimating me had been his biggest mistake. The appeals process had failed, the victim's restitution was proceeding smoothly, and Mason Shaw was learning that superior intelligence wasn't determined by the ability to manipulate others, but by the wisdom to recognize and respect the intelligence around you. I'd built a life that reflected my actual values, capabilities, and dreams. I'd created work that mattered, relationships based on mutual respect, and a sense of self-worth that no one could take away. The woman Mason had tried to destroy had become someone stronger than he'd ever imagined possible, and I was just getting started. As I sit here in my design studio 2 years after that morning when Mason told me I'd never have the courage to leave him, I'm struck by how completely wrong one person can be about another, and how completely wrong we can be about ourselves when we accept someone else's version of our reality. The woman who signed those divorce papers while Mason was at work, who had already packed her belongings and planned her escape, was not the woman he thought he'd married. She wasn't the incompetent, dependent, grateful creature he'd spent 18 years trying to create. She was the woman I'd always been underneath his systematic dismantling of my confidence. I think about all the times I apologized for taking up space, for having opinions, for wanting more than the small life Mason had designed for me. I think about how I'd learned to make myself invisible to avoid triggering his criticism, how I'd shrunk my dreams to fit his narrow vision of my capability. But I also think about the strength it took to maintain any sense of self under that kind of relentless psychological pressure. The fact that I survived 18 years of emotional abuse with my core identity intact, even if it was buried under layers of learned helplessness, speaks to a resilience I never knew I possessed. Mason's biggest mistake wasn't underestimating my intelligence, though he certainly did that. His biggest mistake was believing his own lie about my worth. He'd convinced himself so thoroughly that I was worthless that he stopped seeing me as a threat. He became careless because he genuinely believed I was incapable of the analytical thinking and strategic planning that brought him down. The irony is that everything he dismissed about me, my attention to detail, my ability to see patterns, my persistence in pursuing answers, these were exactly the qualities that made me effective at documenting his crimes. The skills he'd mocked as obsessive perfectionism were the skills that built an airtight federal case against him. I learned something profound about the nature of abuse during those months of secret preparation. Abusers don't just hurt their victims, they fundamentally misunderstand them. They mistake compliance for stupidity, silence for acceptance, adaptation for weakness. They confuse their ability to control someone with evidence of that person's inferiority. Mason spent 18 years thinking he was managing an incompetent woman who needed his guidance to function. In reality, he was suppressing a competent woman who was adapting to an impossible situation with remarkable resourcefulness. Every time I adjusted my behavior to avoid his criticism, every time I made myself smaller to accommodate his ego, I was demonstrating exactly the kind of strategic thinking he claimed I lacked. The woman he thought he'd created was actually the woman who destroyed him. Today, when I help other women rebuild their lives after leaving abusive relationships, I always tell them the same thing: the person your abuser convinced you that you are is not real. The weakness he claimed to see, the limitations he insisted were permanent, the inadequacies he used to justify his control, None of that reflects your actual capabilities. You are so much more than the person someone else needed you to be to feel powerful. And discovering who you really are is the beginning of everything. If you're listening to this story and recognizing yourself in my experience, I want you to know something. You are not crazy, you are not overreacting, and you are not as helpless as someone has convinced you that you are. Maybe you're in a relationship where your partner dismisses your intelligence, questions your judgment, or makes you feel grateful for basic respect. Maybe you've started apologizing for having opinions, second-guessing instincts that used to guide you confidently, or making yourself smaller to avoid conflict. Maybe you've forgotten who you were before someone else started defining your worth. I want you to listen to me very carefully. That person exists. The confident, capable, intelligent woman you used to be, or the woman you've always had the potential to become, she's still there. She's been adapting, surviving, finding ways to maintain her essence despite systematic efforts to destroy it. Your abuser's assessment of your limitations is not an objective evaluation of your capabilities. It's a reflection of their need to control you, their fear of your actual strength, their understanding that keeping you small is essential to maintaining their power. The same qualities that make you effective at managing an impossible relationship, the hypervigilance, the attention to detail, the ability to read emotions and adjust accordingly, these are not signs of weakness, they're evidence of remarkable intelligence and adaptability. You've been using sophisticated survival skills while being told you're incompetent. You've been making complex strategic decisions while being told you have poor judgment. You've been managing an abusive person's emotions while being told you're too emotional. You are already demonstrating the exact capabilities your abuser claims you lack. Start documenting things, not necessarily for legal purposes, though that might become important, but for your own clarity. Write down the conversations that leave you feeling confused. Record the incidents that make you question your own memory. Keep track of the promises that are broken, the explanations that don't add up, the patterns that emerge when you start paying attention. You'll be amazed at how much you actually see and understand when you stop accepting someone else's interpretation of reality. Reconnect with people who knew you before, or who see you clearly now. The friends and family members your partner has encouraged you to distance yourself from weren't negative influences, they were threats to the distorted version of you that needed to exist for the abuse to continue. Most importantly, start making small decisions for yourself. Choose your own clothes, your own food, your own entertainment. Express opinions, even minor ones. Notice how someone who claims to love you responds to your independence. Love doesn't require you to be less than you are. Partnership doesn't demand that you abandon your judgment. Healthy relationships celebrate your strengths rather than systematically undermining them. You have more power than you realize, more intelligence than you've been given credit for, more strength than anyone who needs to diminish you could ever understand. The woman your abuser sees is not the woman you are. You are the woman who's going to save herself. And that woman is extraordinary. Trust her. She's been waiting for you to remember who she is. The divorce papers are already signed. You just have to find the courage to serve them. You've got this. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.